The new crews stepping off the trucks at RAF Mannheim in early 1939 couldn't believe what they were looking at. These were the bombers that were supposed to strike deep into enemy land. Yet they looked like something from an air show, not a frontline squadron. Flight Sergeant James Ward later described his first thought. "I thought someone was joking. My mate nudged me and said, 'They've given us kites.'" The Vickers Wellington sat there on the airfield, its body clearly covered in Irish linen, stretched tight over what looked like a wicker frame. When you knocked on it, it sounded like a drum or a canvas tent. The nickname Wimpy came soon after, borrowed from J. Wellington Wimpy, the hamburger-loving character in the Popeye cartoons. But at first, there was no affection, only disbelief mixed with dark humor. These young men were being sent to fight in something that looked ready for a museum. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had solid, all-metal Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, modern and reassuring. The Wellington seemed ancient by comparison, and in many ways it was. Barnes Wallis had begun his geodetic experiments back in 1930. At training units, instructors kept hearing the same doubts again and again. How could fabric stop shrapnel? What if fire hit it? Would it just burn up like paper? One frustrated instructor at number 15 OTU finally shouted, "Listen here! You think metal's magic? Metal tears. Metal cracks. This!" He slapped the Wellington's side. "This bends, flexes, and keeps flying." The crews nodded, but they weren't convinced. The comparison seemed cruel. The Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley and the Handley-Page-Hampton were all metal aircraft, smooth, strong, and solid. The Wellington looked like someone had stretched fabric over a garden frame and hoped it would work. Veterans from the previous decade's expansion schemes saw it as a sign that Bomber Command hadn't moved forward. Even the rear gunner's position felt unsafe. A fabric-covered turret under a glass dome, where one burst of machine gun fire could end everything. Walking around a Wellington on the airfield almost felt insulting. You could press your hand on its body and feel the basket-like geodetic frame beneath the thin fabric. In places where the surface coating had worn off, you could see the ribs underneath. Ground crews patched holes with bits of fabric and glue, as if mending a shirt. And yet, this fragile-looking thing was meant to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs all the way to Berlin. Flight engineers hated crawling through its narrow geodetic tunnel to reach the back positions. It felt like squeezing through a laundry hamper. But Bomber Command was committed. By September 1939, Wellingtons equipped 8 frontline squadrons. The officers spoke proudly about distributed loads and structural redundancy. But the air crews only talked about surviving long enough to transfer to something made of metal. They climbed into their Wimpy, surrounded by fabric and framework, wondering what kind of genius thought this was enough protection against the most advanced air defenses in the world. Nobody was laughing yet. That would come later, if they lived. Barnes Wallis, however, wasn't just a dreamer drawing ideas on napkins. By 1930, he had already changed airship design with the R-100, using a geodetic frame that spread stress evenly through the whole structure instead of focusing it on a few main supports. When he turned to bomber design, he brought the same logic with him. But now he had to convince the Air Ministry that something which worked for airships could survive enemy fire. The geodetic idea sounds complex, but it's simple once you picture it. A normal bomber then had a few strong spars running along its body and wings to carry the main load, with ribs and stringers to fill the gaps, and metal skin riveted over it all. It worked until flak hit one of those spars. Lose that, and the whole section could collapse. The plane might fold mid-air. Wallis looked at that and saw a fatal flaw, a single point of failure. His answer was both strange and elegant. Instead of a few strong beams holding everything, he built a lattice where every strip helped share the load. The geodetic frame used curved duralumin strips, each about 2 inches wide, crossing in opposite spirals. They met and joined, forming a woven pattern across the wings and fuselage. Every strip carried part of the stress, and every crossing point spread that stress to its neighbors. The math came from geodesic geometry, the study of the shortest paths over curved surfaces. Each strip followed the natural line of force over the plane's body, aligning with stress. So when the aircraft pulled G-forces in a turn, or when the engines generated torque or turbulence hit the airframe, the stress moved smoothly through the entire network instead of focusing on a few spots. If one strip was damaged, the load spread through the rest of the lattice. Even if 10 were damaged, the same thing happened. The frame weakened slowly instead of breaking apart. But what confused everyone was the fabric covering. Even people at Vickers didn't understand it at first. Wallis's answer was simple and practical. The geodetic frame already gave all the strength needed. Adding heavy metal skin would only make it heavier for no reason. The tightly stretched Irish linen was waterproof, smooth, and weighed far less than aluminum sheets. Most importantly, fabric didn't tear apart like metal did. A shell through metal could cause cracks that spread until the whole panel came off. Fabric just left a hole, and the structure kept its strength. The Air Ministry took some convincing. Early test pilots at Brooklands were nervous, half expecting the prototype to fall apart mid-air. But the data didn't lie. A Wellington Mark I could take hits that would destroy a normal bomber and still keep its structure strong enough to get home. On paper and in the wind tunnel, the theory worked perfectly. What no one knew yet was how it would survive real combat. German 80mm shells punching through it at high altitude. The theory would now face its ultimate test. The first missions in late 1939 weren't the deadly bombing runs everyone feared. Instead, Bomber Command ordered leaflet raids, called nickel operations, where the Wellingtons dropped propaganda over Germany instead of bombs. Crews called it bump raiding, joking it was the longest paper route in history. But it gave them something important: experience against German defenses. In early 1940, everyone was still learning how to fight this new kind of war. The tension was obvious. Squadron leader Henry Pleasance of No. 2 Squadron remembered the nervous rituals before flight. In February 1940, pilots would tap the fuselage before climbing in, like they were checking if it was real. One of them said, "Right then, let's see if this kite holds together when Jerry starts shooting." No one laughed. They were all thinking the same thing. The fabric covering felt especially fragile at night when searchlights found you. Suddenly, you were aware that just a few layers of doped linen stood between you and the freezing dark sky filled with enemy fire. Then came the first real operations. On March 19, 1940, Wellingtons bombed a seaplane base. Anti-aircraft fire was moderate but accurate. Several aircraft came. Back damaged, holes in the fuselage, some bent geodetic ribs, a few tears on control surfaces. Ground crews patched them overnight with fabric and dope, and the bombers flew again the next evening. It wasn't heroic yet, just quietly surprising. The damage everyone thought would be fatal wasn't. In April, the raids grew heavier. The attack on Stavanger Sola airfield on the 17th saw Wellingtons fighting German fighters for the first time in numbers. Flight Lieutenant David Balsden's bomber was hit by cannon fire that ripped a line of holes down one side. He could literally see daylight through the gaps where fabric had been blown away, the geodetic skeleton visible beneath, but the aircraft still flew perfectly, responding to every control as normal. When Balsden landed and stepped out, he looked at the holes in disbelief. The same story repeated through May and June. Wellingtons returned with damage that should have destroyed them, yet didn't. One No. 38 Squadron aircraft came back from Mönchengladbach with over 60 holes. The crew counted them one by one. The pilot said it only felt slightly sluggish. The fabric looked like it had been through a shooting gallery, but the frame underneath was doing exactly what Wallis said it would, spreading the load around the damage. crews started talking among themselves. The metal Whitleys and Hamptons were coming back too, but when they got hit badly, the difference was clear. Metal tore along rivet lines, panels peeled off, and beams snapped completely. When a Wellington got hit, you just got holes. When a Whitley got hit, you got failure. That difference mattered when you were flying home over the North Sea in the dark with a wounded plane. By June 1940, the nickname Wimpy began to change. It was still used by everyone, but now there was a hint of respect in it. The plane looked strange and sounded odd, but it kept bringing them home. Wireless operators started patting the fabric beside them like a trusted dog. One rear gunner even wrote, "Bendable but unbreakable," inside his turret. No one openly admitted they'd been wrong yet, but their doubts were fading fast. Then came the night that changed everything. December 16th, 1940. The target was Mannheim, and Mannheim was an industrial city deep inside Germany, far enough to truly test the crews and defended hard enough to make it count. That night, 134 bombers went out, and both the Luftwaffe and the flak batteries were waiting for them. What came back ended every argument since the first missions began. Wellington L-78-18 of No. 149 Squadron landed at Mildenhall just before dawn. The duty officer went out to meet it, then froze. The rear fuselage looked like it had been shredded by a giant cheese grater. Flak had ripped away huge sheets of fabric, leaving the geodetic frame bare for nearly 10 feet. You could stand beside it and see right through the aircraft. The tail gunner, Sergeant Ronald Clark, climbed out pale but alive. He'd watched tracer rounds rip through the fabric just inches away, felt the plane shake as shells exploded nearby. And somehow they had flown 4 hours back to England with half the tail missing. But L-78-18 wasn't the only one. Wellington R-1236 returned with its left wing so torn up that ground crews could stick their heads through holes big enough to crawl through. The metal lattice was visible. Some pieces bent, others nicked by shrapnel, but none completely broken. The wing still held its shape, still gave lift, still obeyed the controls. Flight Lieutenant James Pennell had flown it home expecting the wing to fold at any second. It never did. Then there was Wellington T-2553 of No. 99 Squadron, the most dramatic proof of all. A German night fighter had hit it from nose to tail with cannon fire. The fabric covering hung in ribbons. Whole parts of the frame were open to the air. 3 different compartments were open to the sky. The navigator, Pilot Officer Dennis Field, later said, "I could see stars through the roof, through the walls, through the floor. We were flying inside a skeleton, but we were flying." Ground crews counted 127 holes, each one a wound that the aircraft somehow ignored. The comparison to other bombers that same night told a harsher story. 2 Whitleys were lost over the target. Reports showed both suffered total structural failure after taking flak. A Hampton made it as far as the English Channel before its damaged tail section tore away completely. The crew bailed out and only 3 survived. All of these were all-metal aircraft, supposedly stronger, more advanced. They had taken hits similar to the Wellingtons and simply broken apart. The photos taken the next morning at Mildenhall and other Wellington bases spread fast. Intelligence officers studied every image, trying to understand what they were seeing. Engineers measured how the geodetic structure had flexed and shifted the loads. What Barnes Wallis had only predicted on paper was now proven in combat. Remove 10% of the structure, and the rest would share the stress without failing. In the crew rooms, the talk changed. Pilots who had flown Hamptons before now admitted the difference. The Wellington could take punishment like nothing else. Wireless operators shared stories of sending messages from compartments that weren't even fully enclosed anymore. The jokes were gone. When someone said "Wimpy" now, it meant a strange-looking but loyal friend that always got you home. The night of December 16th hadn't just saved aircraft. It had delivered proof. Then came North Africa. new challenges, same impossible survivals. By early 1941, Wellingtons were flying from rough airstrips in Egypt, striking Italian targets in Libya, and dodging skilled German fighters sent to help Rommel's Afrika Korps. The desert should have revealed every weakness in the fabric and lattice design. Sand got into everything. The heat of the day and the freezing nights tested the materials to their limits, and when aircraft took damage, they had to cross hundreds of miles of desert to get home. One Wellington, Z-883 of No. 70 Squadron, became a legend in June 1941. Hit by flak over Benghazi harbor, it took a direct hit that blew away a 6-foot chunk of the left wing's front edge. Not just fabric, but structure itself. The front lattice was gone, replaced by open air. By any normal rule of physics, the wing should have folded back and torn off. But Flight Lieutenant Kenneth Barker kept it flying. He felt the plane pull violently to the left, corrected with opposite aileron, and was stunned to find it still responded. The remaining lattice had taken over the load, the rear parts of the wing carrying forces they were never meant to handle. But they did. Barker flew that damaged Wellington 240 miles back to base. He had to keep it slightly banked the whole way, burning extra fuel to counter the drag, but it stayed airborne. When ground crews at Fuka inspected the wrecked wing, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Any normal bomber would have fallen apart instantly, but the Wellington's geodetic skeleton had refused to die. The geodetic structure was doing something that went against common sense. It spread the stress through paths that shouldn't even have existed. Metal bombers simply couldn't survive the same kind of punishment. In July 1941, an American-built Martin, Maryland, flying with No. 39 Squadron, was hit by flak over Tripoli. A shell tore through the rear fuselage, and the stressed skin body cracked along the rivet lines. The whole tail twisted 20 degrees out of line, and the aircraft crashed while trying to land at Benghazi. 2 weeks later, a Bristol Blenheim's wing spar was struck over Derna. The wing folded within seconds, and the bomber went straight down. No one survived. With each loss, the physics behind the Wellington's toughness became clearer. In normal metal monocoque construction, the skin itself carried the stress of flight. Every square inch of metal was part of the structure. Once it was pierced, that hole became a weak spot where cracks could spread, and under load the skin could unzip like paper. The Wellington didn't rely on its outer surface at all. The fabric was only there to smooth airflow. Tear it away, and the plane lost speed but not strength. One story from No. 40 Squadron in August 1941 became famous. A Wellington returned from Tamimi after flak had ripped open one side of the rear fuselage. 12 feet long and 6 feet high. All fabric gone. The metal ribs shining in the slipstream. The tail gunner, Sergeant Harold Wisdom, could have reached out and touched the air outside. Even worse, the rudder cables ran through that section, and in most planes, they would have been cut instantly. But the Wellington system allowed the controls to reroute automatically through undamaged channels. The turret still worked. They finished their mission and flew home. By the end of 1941, no one doubted the aircraft's strength anymore. A pilot summed it up perfectly. "Jerry can shoot us full of holes, and we'll wave at him on the way back." To understand why the metal bombers failed so easily, you had to look at how they were built. The Handley Page Hampton used what's called stressed skin construction. Its aluminum panels weren't just a shell, they were part of the framework, riveted to stringers and ribs. The system was light and efficient, but fatally delicate. A fragment punching through the skin didn't just make a hole, it created sharp edges where cracks could start. Under stress from sharp turns or turbulence, those cracks raced along the rivets until whole panels tore free. One small hole became a gaping wound. In May 1941, researchers studied 17 Hamptons lost over Germany. 9 had broken apart from relatively minor flak hits. The skin had literally unzipped. The new short Sterling, introduced that same year as Bomber Command's first 4-engine heavy, showed the same weakness. Its wings, built with multiple spars and stressed skin, carried load between those spars and failed the same way. On July 1941, No. 7 Squadron lost Sterling N-3705 over Hamburg after flak struck near the wing root. German reports said the skin tore back along the rivet lines, twisting the wing beyond its limits. Time from hit to destruction: 8 seconds. Now compare that to the Wellington's record. Between January and December 1941, Wellingtons flew 37,220 sorties. 462 were lost in total, to flak, fighters, weather, and accidents. Only about 40 were believed to have suffered full structural failure. The rest crashed because of engine fires, fatal damage, or loss of control. But the airframes themselves stayed intact. The geodetic skeleton weakened slowly, not suddenly. The math explained it. A normal bomber had maybe 4 main spars, 20 stringers, and a couple hundred rivet lines. Lose 1 spar, and you'd lost 25% of your support. Lose 2, and the wing was gone. The Wellington's lattice had thousands of intersecting load paths. Each one carried just a tiny part of the stress. Even if 50 members were destroyed, massive damage, you'd only lose about 5% of total strength. The rest would instantly take over. In October 1941, No. 109 Squadron proved it again on a raid to Bremen. 3 Wellingtons and 2 Sterlings were hit by flak. All 3 Wellingtons made it home, one riddled with over 80 holes. Both Sterlings went down. Their crews were just as skilled and brave. Their aircraft simply couldn't handle the punishment. Later engineering studies confirmed what air crews already knew. Stressed skin metal bombers were fast and efficient, but only as long as they stayed undamaged. The moment they took real battle damage, the Wellington's strange woven skeleton was the one that survived. That efficiency had turned into fragility. The Wellington might have been heavier and a little slower, but it brought its crews home. By 1942, even the most skeptical officers couldn't argue with the statistics. The Wimpy was surviving, better than any other bomber in the Royal Air Force. The record of those years still carries the voices of the men who flew it. Logbooks, letters, and post-war memoirs full of respect that grew from hard experience. Flight Sergeant Thomas Murray of No. 15 Squadron wrote after a raid on Cologne in May 1942, called it Wimpy for months, like everyone else. Thought it was a joke. Now I'd take this fabric kite over any metal plane they offer. Jerry's hit us 3 times proper, and 3 times she's brought us back. The lads kiss the fuselage after landing now, and we're not joking. Pilot Officer Robert Vollrath's letters to his wife showed the same transformation. In October 1941, he wrote, "Still flying the Wimpy. Looks like a circus tent with engines." By March 1942, Wellington took a beating last night. Fabric torn to bits over the rear, but she flew fine. Starting to see why the old hands trust it. By July, wouldn't trade this plane for anything. It's kept me alive when the fancy ones haven't done the same for others. Wireless operators had the closest connection to the Wellington's bones. They sat right beside the geodetic frame, able to touch it through the thin fabric, listening to every creak. Sergeant Arthur Payne of No. 303, Polish. Squadron described it perfectly. You sit in that tunnel with fabric inches from your head, feel the cold through it, and you think one burst of gunfire and you're done. Then you come back from ops with holes you can fit your fist through. And everything still works, except there's more ventilation. You start trusting it in a way you can't explain. Rear gunners, who faced the most danger, felt the same shift. Sergeant Dennis Wade, who flew 40 missions, recalled, "The first dozen trips I was terrified. Fabric turret, fabric fuselage, felt like sitting in a paper bag. Then, one night, fighter hit us with cannon fire. I saw shells punch through beside my head, and the frame just flexed. Didn't crack, didn't fold, just took it. After that, I stopped worrying about the fabric and started worrying about everything else. The change from mockery to loyalty wasn't instant. Some still doubted, even after surviving multiple missions. Flight Lieutenant James Burton of No. 9 Squadron admitted later, "Didn't really believe in the Wellington until March 43, when we lost an engine over the Ruhr. We were already shot up, fabric hanging in strips. Then the port engine died. One engine gone, half the structure exposed, and it still flew steady. Got us home." That night, I stopped calling it a stopgap and started calling it the plane I wanted to finish my tour in. By mid-1942, the nickname Wimpy had completely changed in meaning. Ground crews painted it on the noses with pride. One No. 419 Squadron aircraft even bore the name Wimpy, the Unbreakable, beside a cartoon of the Popeye character punching a German fighter. The irony had reversed. What began as a joke about weakness had become a badge of strength. Squadron leader Leonard Cheshire, who flew Wellingtons with No. 35 Squadron before moving to Halifax's, summed it up best. "We laughed at them at first. Then they saved our lives again and again. Then we missed them when we switched to something supposedly better." The Wellington proved that looking ridiculous and being effective aren't opposites. I only wish someone had told us that before we spent months insulting it. The numbers told the rest of the story. Between September 4, 1939 and October 8, 1945, Wellingtons flew 47,429 bombing operations. Not just sorties, but full missions involving many aircraft each time. The total sortie count passed 100,000, more than any other British bomber type over the entire war. The survival data revealed why crews trusted it so deeply. During Bomber Command's most intense years, 1942-43, Wellington losses averaged about 3.4% per sortie. The Sterling's losses in the same period were 5.2%, and the Hamptons before its retirement averaged 4.8%. That small difference meant everything to the men flying them. A Wellington crew had about a 67% chance of completing a 30-operation tour, while a Sterling crew had barely 51%. That 16-point gap meant hundreds of lives. The Wellington's endurance was just as remarkable. The Air Ministry had planned to retire it by 1942, once the four-engined heavies arrived, but that never happened. No. 75 Squadron was still flying Wellingtons on combat missions in October 1943, long after Lancasters and Halifaxes had entered service. The reason was simple. Wellington stayed available over 80% of the time, while early Sterlings struggled to stay above 50%. A bomber that could be patched overnight with linen and dope, that didn't need massive structural rebuilds, and that could take hits and still fly. That bomber kept flying. Outside Europe, its service lasted even longer. In the Mediterranean, No. 37 Squadron used Wellingtons for anti-submarine patrols until March 1945, proof that the old fabric kite had outlasted almost everything that once mocked it. In the Middle East, No. 14 Squadron kept flying Wellingtons until May 1945. The RAF's final operational Wellington bombing mission took place on October 8, 1945, over Italy, nearly 6 full years after its combat debut. No other British bomber matched that record. Its many roles proved how versatile the airframe really was. Beyond bombing, the Wellington became a submarine hunter with Lee Lights, a maritime patrol aircraft, a trainer for thousands of air crews, a radar testbed, and even a torpedo bomber with Coastal Command. No. 415 Squadron sank U-boats in 1943, using depth charges dropped from their Wellingtons. The same geodetic skeleton that resisted flak in the skies over Europe handled the pounding of low-level maritime flying with ease. Production numbers showed how much faith Britain had in it. Vickers built 11,461 Wellingtons between 1936 and 1945, second only to the Lancaster among British bombers. When the Air Ministry finally withdrew the Wellington from frontline service in 1943, it wasn't because it had failed, only because four-engined heavies could carry 3 times the bomb load over greater range. The Wellington hadn't fallen behind. It had simply reached the limits of what it was designed to do. Those last missions in 1945 were flown by men who'd never known the pre-war jokes. They had trained on Wellingtons, trusted them completely, and never questioned the fabric skin. For them, the Wimpy was simply what a good bomber looked like. The journey from doubt to faith was complete. The aircraft crews once mocked had become the standard they measured all others against. Post-war testing confirmed Barnes Wallis's ideas beyond question. Between 1946 and 1948, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough studied both surviving and crashed Wellingtons. Their findings were clear. Geodetic construction gave far greater battle damage tolerance than any stressed skin design. A report from March 1947 stated that catastrophic structural failure from combat damage occurred about 60% less often in geodetic aircraft. The Germans had reached the same conclusion years earlier. Captured Luftwaffe files from the Wien Test Center, found in 1945, showed engineers astonished by the Wellington's resilience. An October 1942 report read, "The English basket frame construction absorbs damage in ways our calculations show should be impossible. Recommend analysis for possible adaptation." They never adopted it. It was too complex, too alien to their manufacturing system. That leads to the obvious question. If the design was so superior in combat, why did it disappear? The answer came down to hard wartime math. The Wellington's fuselage needed roughly 11,000 separate metal pieces, each precisely shaped and hand-assembled by skilled workers. A Lancaster's needed only about 2,000. Building a Wellington fuselage took around 800 man-hours. A Lancaster's took 350. In total war, when quantity meant survival, that difference decided everything. The Wellington's strength was unmatched, but its production speed was far too slow. As losses mounted, the Air Ministry chose volume over invincibility. Four-engined heavies like the Lancaster could be built faster, haul bigger loads, and, though more fragile, could simply be replaced more quickly. It was a grim but unavoidable trade-off. Aerodynamics added another limit. The Wellington's fabric skin worked fine up to 15,000 feet and 230 miles per hour. But beyond 25,000 feet and 300 miles per hour, the air pressure alone would tear it apart. Switching to metal skin canceled the weight advantage that made geodetic framing worthwhile, leaving an over-engineered, heavier structure. The jet age ended the idea completely. Jets flew higher, faster, and far hotter. Fabric would burn, and even metal geodetic webs would distort under the heat and stress. Within 5 years of war's end, the principle that had saved thousands of lives was obsolete. Modern aircraft use stressed skin monocoque construction because it's efficient, cheap, and strong enough for peacetime flying, where battle damage isn't expected. Yet the Wellington's legacy survived in a different form. The concept of damage-tolerant design, that an aircraft should weaken gradually instead of breaking apart, came directly from the Wellington's example. Multiple load paths, structural redundancy, and fail-safe design are now standard aerospace practice. The Wellington proved that survivability matters, that bringing the crew home is worth every ounce of extra structure. The last Wellington, a Mark X trainer, flew its final sortie in March 1953. By then, most wartime crews had returned to civilian life, telling stories about the fabric bomber that looked absurd but flew like nothing else. The plane once mocked as Wimpy the Joke had ended its career as Wimpy the Lifesaver, and no later advance in aviation could ever take that honor away.